Yesterday was Yom Hashoa, the day known as Yom Hashoa v'Hagvura, the day of remembrance of the Holocaust and of the Gvura of strength. I'd like to share a couple of stories that are not so well known. You may have heard them from me if you've come to some of my classes, but if not, I don't know if either of these stories are printed, but they are very powerful stories of inner strength. Gvura is not physical prowess, is not physical strength. Gvura is about inner control. And I think both these illustrate very powerful lessons about who we are as Jews at our core. Many years ago, when I was learning in yeshiva, I came home one night to visit my parents, and my dad was very excited. He said, "Nisani, you know what I did today? I interviewed one of the men in shul." I grew up in a shul called the Mirror Minyan of men who learned in the yeshivas in Eastern Europe pre-World War II. Many of them studied in the Mir Yeshiva, hence it's called the Mirror Minyan. They studied in other yeshivas as well. Incredible men who, some of them went through the Holocaust, some of them were able to escape. They were not in concentration camps, but they certainly suffered terribly and lost their families in a terrible way during those years. And my father appreciated history, and he would, even though he was American born, he wanted to hear the stories of these heroic men. And he would interview them about their lives growing up in Eastern Europe, escaping Europe, starting their lives here. And he would record it. Back then it was a tape recorder. So he told me he interviewed one of the men, and he said it was a very powerful story. He said, "I really would like you to listen to this." So that night, even though I had just come back from yeshiva and it was late in the evening, I sat down and I listened to the interview. It's a very painful interview to hear. This particular man, had suffered terribly, suffered greatly in his life, and carried a heavy toll, a heavy burden. Sure enough, the next morning, the man told my father, he said, "I don't want my story out there. It's too painful to think that people might hear my story and might not take it to heart. And it would be even more offensive, sharing my burden, sharing the load of my heart, and people not appreciating it." And he asked my father to give the tape back to him. My father did. And that was the end of the story. I forgot about this. Fortunately, I'd heard the story the night before, but I forgot about it. Many years later, after my dad had passed away, a number of years after my dad passed away, I happened to be in New York. Hashem arranged that I was in New York, and I found out that this old man that lived to a very old age had passed away. And I went to the Shiva house, and I told him the story. I told him about this interview my father had and how my father gave the tape back, and I told him an amazing story that I'm going to share with you momentarily that the man had shared on this recording. And the family were very inspired, but they were sad that there was no record of it. A little while later, I got an email from the son of this man saying he went through his father's files and he found the tape. And he made a copy for me, not of a tape, because by 2010 we weren't using tapes anymore. Made a copy on a digital file, and then he burned it onto a CD and sent it to me. And one of the stories is the story I'd like to share with you now. This man grew up in Lithuania, and he studied in the famous yeshiva in Radin. Radin was a little town where the Chafetz Chaim, the holy Chafetz Chaim, was the rabbi of the yeshiva, the dean of the yeshiva. From there, he went to study in Kamenetz. Kamenetz was another town in Lithuania. And there was a yeshiva there run by the Rosh Yeshiva. The dean of the yeshiva was a great tzaddik, a holy Jew, Rabbi Bar Leibowitz. And this man, his name was Mr. Tsipkin, was in Kamenetz when World War II broke out. Now, when the war broke out, nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew how things were going to play out, how terrible things were going to be. I remember hearing stories from other men where they and their families assumed it would be a short war like many other wars that had been in that area in Eastern Europe, and things would calm down. People had no inkling of how terrible it was going to be. Now, shortly after the war broke out, the Russians and the Germans made a peace pact called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And that pact divided up Poland. And as a result, Kamenetz fell under Russian control. And the yeshiva in Kamenetz was illegal because the Russians did not allow any teaching of religion. And the yeshiva students were sent to Siberia, to a slave labor camp, which was devastating for them to be sent thousands of miles away from their family and to be put in slave labor. Who knows if they would survive? Ultimately, it was the greatest blessing because a short while later, in 1941, the Nazis attacked the Russians, took over Lithuania, and they and their horrible collaborators from the Poles and the Ukrainians and Lithuanians murdered a tremendous amount of the Jews of Lithuania, including most of the Jews in Kamenetz. These small group of yeshiva students were fortunate they went to Siberia and were saved. So my father asked Mr. Tzipkin, and he said, what was it like in the slave labor camp? And he described the harsh conditions and the little bit of food they got and how terrible it was. But he said, you know what, every now and then, one of the Russian guards would go out and shoot a polar bear. And they would kill a polar, they would hunt, and they would catch a polar bear, and they would cook the meat of the polar bear, and that's what the entire camp ate for a day. So he looks at my father, he says, Mr. Zakon, what do you think we did? Did we eat the meat? Remember, there was no 7-Eleven. There was no commissary. There's no place else to buy anything. If you didn't eat the meat, you starved. And he said, no, we did not eat the meat. We were not going to eat non-kosher meat. So we didn't eat that day. The next day, they would cook food that was not non-kosher. They would cook some potatoes or whatever it was they were cooking, or some soup. But it was in pots that had been used for non-kosher meat that was cooked in it within the last 24 hours. And not only is non-kosher meat forbidden to be eaten, but if you eat something that was cooked in that pot that was cooked within 24 hours of when the meat was cooked, that food is also rendered not kosher. So he said the next day, the second day, we also didn't eat because there was non-kosher meat that had been cooked there within 24 hours. So for 2 whole days, they did not eat anything. He said the third day, it already was more than 24 hours since the food had been cooked, since the non-kosher meat had been cooked, and therefore we ate the kosher food that was cooked in those pots. 2 days. Imagine that. 48 hours. How long do we go without a meal? We go a few hours. We go 3 hours. We're hungry. We're starving. We need a snack. We need to eat something. We need to drink something. We fast a half a day. Intermittent fasting is so difficult for people. It's the new rage, but it's so difficult. 2 whole days. And this wasn't once. They never knew when the guard was going to catch a polar bear, hunt and cook a polar bear. They didn't know. Would it be that? And they didn't know when the war would end. A year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Who knew? They had no clue. And yet, they had the inner strength and the fortitude, the courage, the commitment to say, I'm not going to eat non-kosher. Not just non-kosher, I'm not going to eat non-kosher for 2 whole days. I'm not going to eat anything for 2 whole days. We have the opportunity in our lives. We're blessed with food. We're blessed with plentifulness. Even in the midst of Corona, even in the midst of being stuck at home, even in the midst of some of our challenges, we still have so much. There are things that we can cut out of our lives that we don't need, like speaking negatively about other people. Maybe if we're not up to a level of keeping kosher, maybe we can keep an aspect of kosher. There's so much that can be done. I think it would honor the memory of these courageous Jews if we took something on, if we took something out of our life that was not necessary and that was not aligned with Torah. So that's one thing I'd like to challenge you with. The second that I'd like to challenge you with is another amazing story. This story I heard from Rabbi Shimshon Scherer, who's a rabbi in Brooklyn. Many years ago, he took a group of men to Eastern Europe, and they went to tour where the Jews had lived, and the cemeteries, and the old shuls and synagogues, and they went to the concentration camps. And amongst the cities they went to in Eastern Europe, they went to Il. Il is spelled U-H-L, is a town in Hungary. And there was a famous rabbi there in the 19th century, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, known by the book he wrote, Yismach Moshe. So they went to the grave of the Yismach Moshe. They went to daven. They went to pray at his grave. You don't pray to the deceased, you pray in the merit of the deceased. And the Yismach Moshe was a holy Jew, and in order to commemorate his legacy, they built a hut that covered over where he was buried. And you went into this little building, which is where his grave was. So the group went in, and there was a man, I believe he said his name was Mr. Friedler. Mr. Friedler was a healthy, young, strapping man, went and stood to the left of the grave of the Yismach Moshe, and they all started davening, they started praying, and suddenly they look at Mr. Friedler, they notice his complexion has gone white, and he's looking faint, and he's looking weak, and his breathing is heavy, is labored, and they rush him outside to the fresh air, and they bring a chair, and they bring him some water, and after a few minutes, he catches his breath, he says, okay, I'm fine, let me go back in. Goes in the second time, stands at the same place, the exact same thing happens, again, shortness of breath, and so on. Goes outside, gets some fresh air, gets a cup of water, sits down, and he's fine. This repeats itself a few times. Finally, they said, you're not going back in. We don't know what's going on over there, but you're not going back in. He says, well, I don't know what the problem is. I've been fine the entire trip. I'm in perfect health. I don't know why this happened. I'm feeling great till this happened, and right after this, I'm feeling fine. What is this? They said, we don't know, but you're not going back in. And for the rest of the trip, Rabbi Scherer said, Mr. Friedler, we keep on asking everyone, do you have any idea? Why did this happen to me medically, spiritually? Is there a deeper message, a mystical message? Nobody knew. They fly back to New York, and they could land on a Friday morning, and Rabbi Scherer is running around getting ready for Shabbos, and suddenly he gets a phone call from Mr. Friedler. He says, Rabbi, I have the answer. He said, the answer to what? He said, the answer to why I was passing out by the grave of the Yismach Moshe. He says, really? What's the answer? He says, well, I went to visit my dad. My dad's a Holocaust survivor. And I told my dad we went to this concentration camp and that concentration camp and this cemetery and that cemetery and this town and that town. And his father said, yeah, I know this place. I suffered there. I went through this experience. And this place is where I grew up and so on. And then they said, we went to El. But Dad, something so strange happened at El. When we went to the grave of the Yismach Moshe, I felt like I was going to pass out every time I stood to the left of his grave. And his father says, to the left of the grave, huh? Not far to the side. Yeah. He said, oh, I'll tell you exactly why that happened. So really, you could tell me why that happened? Tell me. And his dad says, well, in 1944, when the Germans entered Hungary, I was studying in yeshiva then. And I had a chavrusa, I had a study partner. And my study partner and I decided we were going to try to escape together. And we escaped our town where the Nazis had come in, and we slipped out in the darkness of night to the next town. And we went to the local shul to study, or we stayed in the forest and studied. And then when the Nazis came, we went to the next town, and so on, until we came to El. We came to the town of El, and we saw the city was overrun by Nazis. There were Nazis all over. And we said, we're not making out of here alive. This is it. We're done. So my chavrusa says, okay, well, let's hide out until the Nazis catch us. What should we do? And I said, I really want to see the shul of the Yismach Moshe. He had a famous synagogue there. It was beautiful. It was well known. I'd love to see it. Let's wait for the darkness of night, and let's go check it out. They go, and they see, to their shock and their horrified feelings, they notice that the shul has been overtaken by the Nazis and been completely desecrated. The holy books, the Sfarim, the Sidurim, the Chumashim, they've all been thrown out on the floor, and a Torah scroll, a holy Sefer Torah, has been taken, and the parchment's been rolled out on the steps of this shul. And people, clearly the last number of weeks and months, have been walking on the Torah scroll. It's caked in mud, it's defiled, it's dirty. And they said, what should we do? Nobody's around, what should we do? So Mr. Friedler said, well, a Torah scroll is like a living being, like a human being. When a human being dies, you bury them. When a Torah has been defiled and desecrated, you have to bury it. So under the cover of night, when no one was there, they snuck out, they took the Torah scroll, and they said, where should we bury it? Let's go to the cemetery. And Mr. Friedler said, I have an idea. Let's bury it next to the Yismach Moshe. This was his shul. This is a Torah that was used in his shul. Let's bury the Torah scroll right next to his grave. And we went, and it was late at night, and there were no shovels, there were no pickaxes. But with our own bare hands, we dug a hole. We dug a hole, and we put that Sefer Torah in, and we covered it over. And I turned to my friend, and they said, we just did a great mitzvah of Kavod Torah. The mitzvah of showing honor to the Torah. Let's dance that we merited to do this mitzvah before we die. And we got up and we danced. But God was kind to us, and I survived the war. And my son, where you stood to the left of the grave of the Yismach Moshe, that is where I risked my life to show honor for the Torah, and I buried that Torah scroll. You know, Rabbi Scherer said, we talk about Wi-Fi. You know, today we had someone from Frontier come to repair the Wi-Fi in our house. Wi-Fi, the connection isn't always so good, but the spiritual Wi-Fi, the spiritual connections there. And Mr. Friedler's son, when he stood at that place, he felt the spiritual connection of the dedication that his father had. We, my dear friends, we have that spiritual connection, that spiritual Wi-Fi. We are connected. We may forget about it sometimes. We may lose connection to it. But let's reconnect. On the day of Yom Hashoa V'Agvura, the day of that power, the day of the strength that was shown by these courageous Jews, whether they were courageous by fighting for their lives and fighting for others, whether they're courageous with their internal strength of what they did to retain their connection to Judaism, their spiritual connection. Let us strengthen our connection. Whether it's what we don't allow in, what we don't allow in terms of what we don't discuss that's inappropriate, that's hurtful to others, whether it's what we don't allow into our mouths, or whether it's what we do, the mitzvahs that show our connection. And if we could take something on, that will surely be a great merit for those holy Jews that showed their courage in their own way, and we will commemorate their memories and their legacies by continuing that legacy and by showing our inner strength as well.